to see that recognition and then that participation throughout the years, you also start seeing that Indigenous peoples have been making space in other conversations. So having the Indigenous Peoples Caucus having a collective voice in the climate COPs, and also in the biodiversity COPs, or within World Heritage negotiations, or the fact that Indigenous peoples have permanent representation or participation status in the Arctic Council. Like, all of those things are things that we can track over those years within the book, because we've covered it, but also obviously in other places. But I think that's, at least in those 40 years, what I've been able to see, and what we see, is that growth of recognition and the protection of their rights in a broader space.
Aloha, welcome to Cooper Union, what's happening with human rights around our world. I'm your host, Joshua Cooper, and today we're very fortunate to be looking at an amazing publication known as the Indigenous World. And we're hosting and featuring Dwayne Mamo. He's the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs, Documentation and Communication Manager, as well as the General Editor of the Indigenous World. Dwayne's been working in humanitarian emergencies and human rights for nearly 20 years. In the Caucasus, in the Middle East, Central and Southeast Asia, North and East Africa, and Europe for various NGOs, including World Vision and CARE. His work focused on children's rights, freedom of expression, and Indigenous peoples' rights. We're very excited to talk to him because the Indigenous World was just released at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues 25th session. Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for wanting to talk about this really unique piece of work that we do with hundreds of others around the world. This is fantastic.
No, I know, as a matter of fact, every year at the Permanent Forum, the Indigenous world is such a rush that so many people are going to that side event. It sort of makes people's moment, and everybody holds up the book and they say, look what I've got. And maybe you could share with us a little bit about the book itself. It's a unique publication that covers so much, and it's such a great tool as a professor, but also as a great way of catching up with what's happening around the world, because so much is happening in Indigenous issues.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Let me just start with what it is, and then maybe I can talk a bit about sort of how the idea came about and how it's evolved. But basically, it's exactly as you said, right? So this edition, the 2026 edition, which is the 40th one, basically gives a yearly update of the situation of Indigenous peoples and their rights across the world, either in various countries or within various international processes or mechanisms for the year before. So the 2026 volume covers the events from January to December of 2025. And the intention of it is to give a brief snapshot of the successes, but also the hardships, the regressions in law, those kinds of things that are happening that specifically impact Indigenous peoples. And the idea for it is that year on year, you'd be able to see that progress or not with that situation, recognition, participation of Indigenous peoples. And the hope is that the book is used by anyone who finds it useful. So, such as in your case, you are also an author in the book and have been for a long time, for academics, whether in their research or in their teaching, for a lot of lawyers use the book as well in their cases when it comes to cases against business enterprises, even state governments, for civil society organizations, for non-governmental organizations. So for a whole host, of people, for a very broad audience. And it also, in some ways, also acts as an act of solidarity as well for Indigenous peoples themselves and their organizations, as they see themselves, as they represent themselves and what their situation is, and can also sort of see that throughout in other places or within other mechanisms. So it's quite a unique piece of documentation. It takes quite a long time to produce. I'm quite amazed that IWGIA has managed to do this for 40 years, and I'm always surprised and happy that we're able to get it done. I've been doing it now for 7 years, and it's been also such a learning process for me. Um, and it really is a treasure trove of information. I would say it should be people's first stop if they want to understand the reality of Indigenous peoples from both a very high level to a very detailed level, depending on where their interests lie. But perhaps I should talk a little bit about where it started.
Sure.
So yeah. Well, obviously, it started 40 years ago. It started in 1986, and actually, the way it came about was that there was, at the time, IWGIA was at a workshop on Indigenous rights, which was being held in Geneva in September of that year, of 1986. And it was at that meeting that actually the IWGIA staff present were requested by the group of Indigenous peoples who were there to say if we could provide some sort of detailed account of what had happened in the world of Indigenous peoples in the previous 12 months. I mean, IWGIA at that point, had been an organization for almost 20 years. We were founded in 1968, and we were founded by anthropologists, which means that back then and through today, we're known for our rigorous documentation and research. So I suppose that one of the reasons why we were asked to do that was because of that respect, and both the respect and trust we have within the Indigenous community, but also the level of academic rigor that we bring to the work that we produce, often in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. So that's how it started. So IWGIA took on that request by the Indigenous group, and so the book came out the following year, and the Indigenous group that asked for it said it would be really helpful for them to have this piece of documentation. So that first book in 1986, it covered about 66 countries and territories and 5 international processes at the time. It also included, the first few editions also included a bit of an overview of the work that IWGIA had done also in the past. And then the book started evolving, right? We started expanding our network and the need of covering other processes, or also as other processes, came into existence, right? In 1986, there was no such thing as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, or the Expert Mechanism on Indigenous Peoples, or the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. These things didn't exist in 1986. But as they came about, as the working groups came about to start to help establish these mechanisms and mandates, the Indigenous world was there and reporting on those developments. And so what you have is from then until today, you can sort of trace both the progress of the state of Indigenous peoples and their rights within countries and territories, but also throughout the international advocacy and human rights space. And it's quite staggering, actually, how much has been able to be covered over these years. So over the last 40 years, we've covered 56 different international processes and mechanisms, and also international issues. For instance, like in the last 2 editions, we've been covering the just transition. And over the last 40 years, we've covered 119 different countries and territories. And some of them very consistently, and some of them, of course, maybe not so much, as we're completely dependent on our network of volunteer authors who just give up their time and their expertise to contribute to this one-of-a-kind book. But we do have, across all 40 editions, there's 8 countries in the book that have been covered every single year, and there's 9 that have been covered in 39 of the editions. And there's about 24 or so that have been covered in over 30 of them. So when it comes to the countries themselves, there's quite a few countries where we can see that progress and that story of the situation of Indigenous peoples' rights. And for certain mechanisms, it's the same. So we've been covering the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues not only since 2000 when it started, but also in all of the working groups to set it up. And also such as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who the mandate celebrated its 25th anniversary also this year. We've been covering that mandate ever since the beginning, since 2000. So yeah, it's quite a massive endeavor. And before I let you move on to the next question, I do have to say, because it really is a work of collaboration, and we work with so many people across the world. Many of them are Indigenous, many are not. They're lawyers, they're academics, researchers, professors like yourself. They're Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous who work in the civil society space and for non-governmental organizations and UN special rapporteurs. It's a very broad network of people. And over the last 40 years, it took me some time because I actually literally went through page by page of every single book. But I was able to count over 950 different individuals who've contributed to this book over 40 years. Some have contributed once or twice, others have contributed many, many times. Not to sort of put you on the spot, right? But you've contributed to the book many times. You've been contributing since the 23rd edition, so since 2009, and have contributed to the current edition. So you're part of that very broad network of people who share their expertise with us through the book to shine a light on the situation of Indigenous peoples, which is extremely valuable. And we at IWGIA and myself, we're just extremely thankful for that network of people.
No, and as you mentioned it did make me want to think like, wow, if you think 40 years and 9, covered every time. Maybe you could say which one those are, and was it maybe 5 or many authors and over 950 different people contributing. That is quite an amazing accomplishment with all the different writing styles, with everything to pull that together into this annual compilation that the world understands and looks forward to of the Indigenous world. Which ones have been covered every time, and what can people aspire to?
Let me just pull up my table and see if I can sort it quickly as we're talking. But yeah, those countries that have been covered in every edition are Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, India, Mexico, Paraguay, and Venezuela. And so it's just quite fascinating. Part of that, we have a strong focus on Latin America since the beginning, but that's also because that's where IWGIA started. In 1968, this group of anthropologists that met, mostly Scandinavian ones, had met and spoke about they wanted to do something to start, what's the word I'm looking for, to raise awareness around particular genocides that were happening to Indigenous peoples in that continent. And so we've had a very strong connection with Latin America from the beginning, but from that work and as our expertise grew and our what's the word I'm looking for? As we became known within the Indigenous movement, of course, our work expanded to Africa, Asia, North America, and so on. But yeah, those are the 8 countries, and then there's obviously several more that have been covered many, many times. What was the second part of your question?
I was just saying it's such a great way to be able to really understand the history of a country, that you could look at 8 and see them from the beginning. And we definitely understand Latin America being important, especially at that time. It's what people always begin with. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 1493, stole everything he could see. And you have, the Bishop of Chiapas, Las Casas coming in, and all those aspects. And of course, even the ILO, International Labor Organization, began covering indigenous rights in the 1920s to look at the situation of what was happening. And now, as you mentioned, also the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, it's amazing that the person who helped create the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, Francisco Cali, who then became the Special Rapporteur after a couple, and is now an ambassador from Guatemala to the UN in Geneva. So, as you said, if you look at this document, it's so rich to see the evolution of Indigenous people's rights and where it's come from and where it's headed. But you also brought up great points of how challenging it is, and looking at the hardships as well as the hopeful moments. The one side I think that everybody would be fascinated about is some of the detail of what goes into coming up with the Indigenous world. Like, what's the timeline? When do people have to start working on it? And how does it work for you? And, just that whole in a calendar year, that would be exciting, because in a way it's sort of sharing how the sausage is made in some sense, but it's quite delicious and everybody loves feasting their eyes on it once it's produced. And I know this year it barely made it to the permanent forum. You guys were stressed out a little, but it was there in good luggage and made it in the end. But I know it's something everybody gets so excited about. So kind of walking them back from permanent forum side event, getting their hot hands on it, to like how it is born every year.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Well, listen, I'm always surprised that we're able to get it done in time, because it's quite a lot of work. But it's sort of all hands on deck, when things get started. But basically, we always know, at least, up until the last 20 years or so, we've been lucky enough and privileged enough to be able to launch the book as a side event to the UN Permanent Forum. So we always know we have that to shoot for. So once we know when the next session of the Permanent Forum is, we know that sometime in that first week is when we're going to launch the book, which means then basically I take that date, that Monday, or actually really the Friday before, because we all have to fly in from Copenhagen to, that's where we're based, to get to New York. And then just starting working backwards. So how long does it take to actually physically print the book, and go from there? So we always have the book digitally ready weeks in advance, right? But it's just the fact that it takes a lot of time to print such a book. The book that we finished this year is one of the biggest ones we have, at close to 1,000 pages. So that's not only is that a lot of pages to print, it's also a lot of pages to bind. And when we're talking something that big, it usually requires glue binding, which adds 2 to 3 days of time for it just to dry. So you're factoring in all of these things, and then I just start working backwards from there. But of course, we have the time limit that the Indigenous world covers the 12 months of the year prior. So while some authors might start working on their pieces in late, in this case, late 2025, there still may be important developments that are happening in November, December of that year that need to be put into the article. But so basically, I'm working to that deadline, and in about I'd say around September or so, we have a conversation at IWGIA about what the editorial theme of the book should be. It wasn't the case that we had an editorial theme for the book at the very beginning of the production of it, but over the last many years, we have decided to focus on something. In this year's edition, it's on peace and security. We've covered conservation, youth, Indigenous women, these kinds of things to further not only show the development of the situation of Indigenous people's rights, but also particularly to an issue. And we cover that in the editorial that we write. And we also ask authors to have a bit of a spotlight on that in their article, in addition to the normal things that they cover. So once we've developed and decided on what that editorial theme should be, then we start reaching out to our network of authors and see if there are current ones that would like to continue to contribute. Sometimes people, need to stop for one reason or another. Some people go on sabbatical. Some people just need a break, or they're just too busy writing a thesis or involved in important court cases, those kinds of things. But we reach out to our network to see who thinks they'll be able to volunteer their time to produce such an article. So we usually start contacting in October, November, and we start getting drafts in of the articles by the first week of January. And that's really where the rubber hits the road kind of thing, because basically from the beginning of January, we only have until mid-March to get the book completed so that there's time to print and for the book to be delivered. And we do it in 2 languages. So at the beginning in 1986, we only did it in English, but from 1989 onwards, we've also done it in Spanish. So all of us at IWGIA are working with our authors. I'm the person sort of putting everything together, and I'm also working with authors for particular regions or processes that I'm working with and following. So we make sure that the experts within IWGIA are the ones working on the articles that are within their expertise area. And we go through many redrafting processes as that's going on. And then I'm getting things proofread, I'm getting things translated, I'm sending things to our designer to start putting it into the book. And, it's just a big puzzle, So one day the designer might get the Spanish version of Taiwan and also the English version of the UN Special Rapporteur and biodiversity. And then the next day he's getting 6 in Spanish and 2 in English, and we're just slotting things in. And then once all of that's put together in a large PDF, which is anywhere from 600 to 1,000 pages, me and a couple of colleagues with a fine-tooth comb, we go through every single page of that book to make sure that what's supposed to be there is supposed to be there. Because obviously with something that big, things go missing. An author's biography goes missing, a section of an article goes missing, a map of a country is put in the wrong place, or a Spanish map finds itself in the English book, that kind of thing. And we do that. I probably go through the book about 3 times in the process of about a week, page by page, to make sure that then what we have ready to go to the printer is as perfect as it can be. And then the Spanish book process follows it's about 2 weeks behind, just because of the translation issue. And that's also why when it comes to launch time in New York, we have the physical English book ready, but not the Spanish book. And also because of logistical concerns and everything else, we actually print the Spanish book in Latin America, where it's easier for those who speak that language and need that information for their work and their advocacy. It's easier to get it to them faster there. But both PDFs are ready and available. And usually once the permanent forum side event is done and it's launched, and we've handed all the books to people who are there who want to receive them, about half an hour after that, everything's online and free for everyone to look through. So it's quite a long process. It's quite a big process compacted in a small amount of time. But to be honest, it's about 4 months. From the time we contact authors to the time we launch the book, it's about a 4-month process, and it's every year. So I'm celebrating Indigenous World's 40th edition now. Summer will happen when we're all back from summer holidays and break and whatnot. I'm thinking about the 41st edition already and trying to see what needs to get done for that.
No, it's quite intense and immense at the same time. So I definitely appreciate hearing just behind the scenes. And for most people, they just look forward to receiving it. They don't know all that goes into it. So I think they really will appreciate that. Can you share over the 4 decades, maybe some of the changes that you've seen over time and some of those aspects that people could look for? I mean, when it was there, right, at the permanent forum this year, and you saw the cover with all 40 covers on it, that was kind of exciting. And it definitely made me want to go back and look in the two places that you describe it. One is country and Indigenous peoples in those nations working for self-determination, free, prior, informed consent, and then the other is the processes that Indigenous peoples are shaping and shifting international law to be more recognizing the inherent dignity of Indigenous peoples. Can you share some of the big changes over that time that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly what you're alluding to is the biggest change, right? Um, the biggest change is that in 1986, the level of recognition of Indigenous peoples at a global level and at a national level was not where it is today. And the reason why it's here today is because of the Indigenous movement and their constant fight for their recognition and for the protection of their rights. Um, in the broader sense, at the international human rights level, within mechanisms within the UN or in the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights or the African Commission of Human and People's Rights, but also using that as a way to secure the recognition and protection of their rights at the national level, and at the regional level. I think that's the biggest thing, because once that recognition comes, right? So once you have a UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, once you have MRIP, once you have the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and you have a Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' rights in Latin America as well, and you have the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples in the African Commission, you start having these spaces and these places that you've fought for, where you have legal precedent in some places, right? Like with ILO Convention, 169, which is probably the first global legal space where Indigenous peoples could refer to, right? And that was in '89, so that was by then the third edition of the Indigenous world, and we did cover ILO Convention 169, of course, and to see that recognition and then that participation throughout the years, you also start seeing that Indigenous peoples have been making space in other conversations. So having the Indigenous Peoples Caucus having a collective voice in the climate COPs, and also in the biodiversity COPs or within World Heritage negotiations, or the fact that Indigenous peoples have permanent representation or participation status in the Arctic Council. Like, all of those things are things that we can track over those years within the book because we've covered it, but also obviously in other places. But I think that's, at least in those 40 years, what I've been able to see, and what we see is that growth of recognition and the protection of their rights in a broader space.
And you did bring up the Arctic. I think that was one of the most exciting aspects of the launch. Was you had the amazing activist from the Inuit, or the Kalaalleq Nunaat, Greenland. And she's able to then talk about, of course, the theme of peace and security, but put a light on this important issue that has only been grabbing headlines without everyone understanding the rich movement for self-determination by the Inuit people for this entire time. And I think that her presentation really did get everyone excited to read every chapter, but put it the larger theme of peace and security from the Indigenous perspective.
Yeah, you're speaking about Dr. Sarah Olsvig, who's the current president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And she's also contributed to the book, also for the Arctic Council article that's in this year's edition, but also in former editions as well. And she was a former board member of IWGIA as well. So we have a very good relationship with her. And yes, when we talk about peace and security, I mean, which is the theme of the Indigenous world this year, it's evident that the issue of the Arctic, especially with Greenland, had to come up, because in some ways that's the whole world is talking about it, but it's also very important for Indigenous peoples. I mean, we're talking about a place that is indigenous, that's been colonized and now is under a global spotlight, not just from rhetoric coming from the West, but is also part of an area of the world that is being seen as rich in resources and potentially, the subject of exploitation of land and people again. And we know there has been a lot of international solidarity from Indigenous peoples all over the world to the Inuit of Greenland, and it really has become a defining point in some ways of what we're talking about today. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why we had her speak on the panel, because there is so much attention to it. And though the attention is negative in some ways, it's also positive in other ways, because it has been able to broaden that larger discussion of who are Indigenous peoples and what does self-determination mean, and what does their government structures mean, and how do they administer themselves, as a people of a land that is theirs. So yeah, and those kind of conversations and that kind of analysis sort of runs through many of the articles within the Indigenous world this year. I mean, the issue of peace and security is not just about that, right? It's also about, for instance, in Latin America, it's about territorial integrity. It's about fights with illegal cartels, illegal logging industries. We have a lot of countries in the world, a lot of national governments are starting to speak about national security agendas. And they're starting to speak about these security agendas in ways that could potentially allow them to ignore certain principles and certain laws in the name of keeping a nation state and its borders secure and intact. And this is incredibly dangerous for Indigenous peoples, because what it means is many of the laws, much of the recognition, much of the participation that they've fought for, principles like FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, like you brought up before, can become either ignored or can be sped up to a point that they're not meaningful, or nation states and corporate actors and whatnot can just freely move with their actions because it's in the name of security. And another facet of it is, of course, that Indigenous peoples in many places are often also located at borders of nation states or across borders, and end up becoming caught in the middle of something that is extremely dangerous and huge, especially with this extra focus now on peace and security. So it was very important for us. These are the kind of discussions that we have, that I was telling you about earlier, that we start having in August, September, October, when we start thinking, is there something that we are seeing within the work that we do, the conversations that we're having, that we think we should focus on for the next edition, because we think this deserves some attention. And we know that the Indigenous World is quite a popular publication. We're very proud of it. It's read by tens of thousands of people every year, and we feel like it's part of our job and our mission to obviously raise awareness on not just the countries and the processes that we follow, but also to speak more broadly about certain themes, whether positive or negative, that we see that are coming up.
And that gets to really the other aspects of, you talked about the main themes. You can definitely see the implications of the rush for resources, such as in Greenland, but you also saw the themes of multilateralism and crisis, and also sharing a bit about the reprisals for Indigenous peoples at international events, and even the criminalization of just being Indigenous in certain states. Maybe you could summarize a bit as we were wrapping up, but I think those were also high-level conversations of some of the major aspects of the publication this year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's no secret that for the last year and a half, 2 years, multilateralism has really been it's really fighting for its survival, right? And that's a real shame after where we are in the world post World War II, and the very foundations of why the UN was founded on multilateralism and human rights and the principles of non-discrimination and all of those things have helped us for the last 80 years as humans and also as Indigenous peoples, right? Who are obviously also human, but those are the things that we can sort of hang our hat on, that we have protections. Now, they might just be on paper and we have to constantly fight for the correct implementation of them. But for those things to exist, this environment of multilateralism and support for human rights and support for non-discrimination needs to be there. And we're seeing that it's in crisis, and the civil society space is shrinking, and that's been evident for many years before multilateralism has begun to be questioned, and defunded and abandoned, and that shines through within the book. Our authors note that as well. And the other thing that's noted, and it's not necessarily noted within the book, but it is something that is related to this, and that's the idea of reprisals. And that's something that we are seeing a lot, and it's increasing, and it has been increasing over the years, where part of it is because the principles of multilateralism are being questioned, and partly because national security agendas and which means also national budgets are being siphoned that way, are having a shift of focus to all of those things, which means then that for the protection of a nation state or for the protection of an ideal or something, that people who are speaking truth to power, even in places that are sacred and safe, like within the UN, these people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but since we're speaking about Indigenous peoples today, are these Indigenous advocates, who are putting their words and literally their lives on the line for speaking the truth about what's happening to them and their peoples in a place. They are becoming, the increase of reprisals is astounding, and voices are being shut down. And I'm constantly amazed and just humbled by the strength that these people have to know that sometimes what they say might be very dangerous for them. They can be arrested once they arrive back home. They can be criminalized. They can be slandered across national social media platforms. Or obviously in the worst cases is becoming imprisoned or killed, which has happened. But also knowing that perhaps you might show up to Geneva, New York, or somewhere else in a safe international space, say what you have to say because you're saying the truth, and then realizing that you may never get to go back home after you said that. And that's very dangerous to what it does, not only for Indigenous peoples and their freedom of speech. It's dangerous for everyone else as well. And I think it's also very interesting that in many ways, sometimes, what we see happening to Indigenous peoples can often be the first step in us realizing that this might become broader. As we say in the book, often with this theme of peace and security, it's Indigenous peoples that are on the front line of this. They're seeing it and being affected by it first. Much like we say the same thing about the climate crisis. It's Indigenous peoples that are seeing the effects of the climate crisis first, and have been for decades, and have been speaking out about it for decades. So it's one of those things that shouldn't be taken lightly. There's hundreds of millions of indigenous peoples on the planet. They form 16% of the population of the world. And they often are seeing what's happening to the planet and to humanity first. And we should be listening to them. We should be including them in our conversations, in the solutions that we need to come up with together to help us survive in the best way possible. But yeah, that's the hard part of putting the book together. Is there are a lot of sad stories and negative developments, and that can sometimes be difficult to reconcile with on a personal level. Doing this year after year, but it's also very important to communicate that. But I also must say, like, we can't forget that we should also, and we do, communicate the positive. I mean, for all of these reprisals and for multilateralism coming into crisis and for the FPIC being abandoned in places for various agendas, right? We do see in our country articles and in national and in international processes, places where indigenous peoples are making strides, right? There are still many places where the recognition of indigenous people has now become enshrined in national law. We do see that indigenous peoples have managed through lots of concerted advocacy over years and years and years to perhaps stop extractive industries to be taking place in a national forest or a national conservation area, which does happen, right? Or for pastoralists to ensure that they are legally allowed to use the land they've always used, that is now considered a conservation area, but they're still allowed to be on the land, to use the land in their traditional ways, right? So there are still also within the book, thankfully, there are still also positive developments that indigenous peoples are sharing within these articles. So I also want to make sure that we don't forget that, yeah, because in these days, sometimes it's hard. Everything seems to be so bleak, but there are positive things also to celebrate. And we do that in the book as well.
No, and that really put it in a great perspective. Couple of things. One is that people always say a 2-minute, 3-minute intervention, how powerful is it and what difference does it make? But what you're highlighting is what indigenous peoples have always faced. When indigenous people first came to the working group in the 80s, many people who did go home were executed. And now a 1-minute speech, a 2-minute speech, a 3-minute intervention, what does it do? It's so powerful that it scares countries to overreact in so many ways. So I think that really does put that in perspective. But your other side, which is super powerful, is we're at the 80 years of the United Nations, and the indigenous world has been there for half of that. So if you wanted to see what's happened with the UN and indigenous peoples and that whole theme of nothing about us without us, half of those years of the whole entire existence of the UN, the indigenous world will be your place to go to understand that and to get a great depth and perspective from the directly impacted people. So I want to thank you so much for taking time out today, but also throughout the entire year to, as you said, weave all those pieces together. And as we discussed now, you got me thinking, what new things could we add? What is it that, reaches that level? And everyone looks forward to the next 41st edition. And thank you again for all that you do. Mahalo.
Thank you very much. And thank you for wanting to shine a light on this. I think it's really important. People know who it is, but I want more and more people to know what this book is and to pick it up and read the parts that are important and interesting to them and to share it. So thank you. And I look forward to you writing for the next edition as well.
Yes. Thank you. Aloha.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.